First of all, a big thank you to everyone and good afternoon. I will present some of the insights into a research project that we are currently carrying out. With the longer title, I've shortened it down to knowledge transfers for blue urbanism, because this is really at the center of our interest. I have to admit that we have a relatively clear urban focus in our project, but I think that some of the questions that we ask and some of the interests that drive our research are also very much applicable for analyzing knowledge transfers also in urban-rural setups and the linkages that are established here. So I'm just trying to switch the slide. Yes, now it's working. So the work that we are currently carrying out together with a lot of partners, amongst them also Andy and his team at UI, but also partners at the National University in Singapore and at Ateneo de Manila. It has been embedded in an earlier phase, already also financed by the German Science Foundation, that was focusing on what kinds of ideas and recipes for living with, or also living against sea level change, something that I call here climate solutionism, how some of those ideas gain traction or political interest, political legitimacy, why and how. Also asking what kind of interests the projects serve that can be observed in climate change adaptation. And it was not surprising to find that many of the solutions that are implemented or at least discussed in many Southeast Asian cities often hinge on the emphasis of grand infrastructural projects. Most of them also very much expert-driven projects, for example, influenced by Dutch, Japanese, Danish, and also German consultancies that propose certain blueprints to those cities. At the same time, it is also clear that those blueprints and the ideas that are proposed to those cities go through changes. The flow of ideas is not unidirectional, but there's also a circulation and travel back to places of origin of some of those ideas. When you look at how cities and the urban areas are displayed in global discourses around climate change, it is quite clear that there's a clear dualism. On the one hand, and I'm citing here from a very recent UN Habitat document, on the one hand, cities are displayed as being increasingly at risk. Cities worldwide are increasingly suffering the effects of climate-related and other challenges and hazards such as floods, drought, sea level rise, heat waves, landslides, and storms, and so on. Home to more than half of the world population, cities and towns are places where people, assets, and economic activity are concentrated and are at risk. So there's a clear risk focus here. On the other hand, cities are also displayed as bearing a lot of opportunities. And the document goes on, while facing important challenges, cities are also places of opportunity and innovation in developing sustainable solutions to bounce forward after a disruption. Therefore, climate adaptation is one of the key priorities for future urban resilience and the health and well-being of people and the environment. So you see that cities do play a crucial role also in those adaptation discourses and are displayed as both risk driven as well as opportunity driven. And with those two premises in mind, we have turned for this the second phase of our project, we've turned towards the discourse of blue urbanism, a term that has been coined by planning scholar Timothy Beatley from 2014 onwards, and that has been quite successful as broad reference point for urban planning also in the context of climate change since then. The starting point of the debate has been a claim of a new urbanism that needs to bring back the ocean into the cities, blurring also the strong boundaries between both and frontiering the urban and the oceanic. The main aim of Beatley's intervention was to reconnect cities with the oceans that surround them often, combating ocean blindness, as he has called it. And he did so by applying what we think is a mainly utilitarian and very much resource-centric understanding of oceanic ecosystems. His intervention concentrates very much on, for example, waterfront leisure, on community fisheries, aquaponics, the use of tidal energy, etc. And he did so by mainly translating his ideas of green urbanism that he has worked on before to the idea of blue urbanism. Just very much, we think, keeping or continuing the very terrestrial mindset in urban planning that that is still also very obvious in blue urbanism. Another critique that we have with regard to his approach is that it's very much northern centric, and it is very much flattening transcultural differences also in the kind of how cities interact with the oceans and the sensibilities that come with them. Also, when it comes to the examples that he brings forward, you see that it's very much a northern-centric discourse, bringing in Rotterdam, New York City, Copenhagen, and to a lesser extent also Singapore. So we felt the need to delve deeper into what we think is really crucial here, namely the politics of future making, because much of the projects that we've observed are very much working with aspirations, also with imaginaries of futures that are envisioned for the cities. And this is very much a research focus that we have, looking at how imaginaries, but also policies and practices of futuring cities along coasts and in deltas are negotiated. And we do so by focusing on two very concrete infrastructural solutions that have been gaining traction in global discourses, but also within the region. Again, putting into conversation the cities that we've concentrated before, Singapore, Manila, and Jakarta, but take a more global picture here, and also bringing in some of cities, for example, in Western Europe, Rotterdam, Dordrecht, or Hamburg, that work with some of those solutions, and also cities in Tokyo and South Korea. So those infrastructures that we look at are multifunctional dikes, a form of protective living, keep the water out of the cities. And the second infrastructural solution are floating structures and artificial islands, a more amphibious way of living with and also making a living from coastal waters. Of course, when looking at those expert-driven and in some forms also the very much elitist discourses that you see in relation to those technologies, it is clear that those very general ideas also do not justice to the I would say messy realities on the ground. And I'm bringing in some examples from northern Jakarta here. When you look at what you could call blue urbanities in northern Jakarta, you see that they reflect, of course, a multiple of lived realities, diversity of waters, a multiple littoral, as we call them. And when you look at those spatial interventions that you see, there, of course, there's a succession of planning or development mantras that have changed over time and that very much influence the space-making processes here. And in recent years, and this is not only in Jakarta, but in many cities in the region, you see a transfer from risk to more incentive-driven interventions, something that we call speculative futuring. And this is true for many cities in the area. When you look at those larger processes like the Manila Bay Master Plan, or also the NCICT in Jakarta, or Singapore's adaptation pathways, you see a lot of infrastructural development, large-scale infrastructure, a lot of concrete that is put into those coastal areas, of course, also adding value to places that are already at risk. And you might maybe talk about catch-up development of heavy infrastructuration, but I leave this with a question mark. So now I'm having trouble to switch the slides. Here we go. And the Great Garudas, or the NCICD, and the envisioning process behind it is also maybe something that could explain a bit more what we mean with the speculative futuring. Of course, this comes as well with different forms of island reclamation, something that you could call a new coast rush, creating land from the sea to also kind of finance some of the protective infrastructures that you want to put into place. So a lot of value in speculative futuring that you see, and this is also happening in other places. Here's the city of Pearl in Metro Manila, a whole city quarter that is supposed to be put into the coastal waters and to add value here as well. As I said, we're mainly interested also in the kinds of knowledge transfer that is going on, and when simply looking at the involvement of external actors in the projects, those larger projects that we've looked at, the adaptation pathways in Singapore, the Manila Bay Master Plan in Manila, and the NCICD in Jakarta, you see that there's a lot of external expertise that goes into the creation and the blueprinting of those projects. With, for example, I'm just picking out one example here, Del Tares, the Dutch Water Institute, that is practically active in all three cases, and that brings, of course, a certain expertise and mindset to those planning processes. At the same time, you also see, of course, objections to this form of external intervention. This is just a very brief picture of a protest in Jakarta that especially thematizes this international involvement and criticizes it as well. As I said before, we're also interested in the differences, how then on the ground in affected communities adaptation looks like. We're talking here about the everyday life worlds of subsidence as one of the driving forces behind the relative sea level rise that you see in, for example, in northern Jakarta. And you see, of course, a multiple watery flows, different fluxes and states that are to be seen in those places. And you do see, of course, also a myriad of adaptive practices that are very much in contrast to what I've displayed earlier in the context of speculative futuring and those grand infrastructural projects. You see a lot of small-scale adaptive practices, vernacular practices, you could call them, that are, of course, perceived mainly reactionary, piecemeal solution, household-based, but still there is a lot of practices and activities of people living in those areas, in the wetlands, or you see in those small quotes below, we live between swamp and soil. It's now like a river, wet all the time, but still people are dealing with those kinds of situations. One of those practices, for example, is Nimbun, self-reclamation, an act of soil making where construction, rubble, wooden shards, shells are used to raise grounds, to create a floating mass that is soggy to the food, permeable to floodwaters, and is very much a gendered social practice, but also a very distinct urban knowledge that also reacts to some of those sea level changes that are happening there.
You have 2 minutes, Dr. Herbeck.
2 minutes, yes, that's fine. I'm coming to an end. I mean, to conclude, maybe to give a first idea why we think it's important also to listen to the stories, to different kinds of stories that I've just depicted, and also to the polarities and binaries that come with it. I mean, first you see this difference between dry versus watery territory making that we also reflect in those different technologies that we look. Then also this difference between reclamation, the idea of reclamation versus thoughts of managed retreat that are also increasingly led in certain areas at least. And then this difference between dystopian versus utopic imaginaries, also a difference between marginality and affluence in coastal areas. And then, as I've showed, the big difference between grant projects that also come along often with gentrification processes versus those everyday practices of survival and transgression that are also important to look at. So what does it mean? What can I conclude also for today's session? I think although we're concerned with rural-urban linkages, I think it's also important to understand this international city-to-city connections when we want to see this kind of knowledge transfer that can happen and has to happen in coastal adaptation processes. We have seen a focus on grant infrastructure projects beyond risk-centeredness that were there before, connected with what we call speculative futuring. We have seen that blue urbanism could be a potential new planning paradigm, but it has to account for the cultural differences that are prevalent in regions. So, and I'd like to maybe start with end with two simple questions. I mean, one would be, how can we understand knowledge transfer also of those specific local forms of adaptation, the low-cost solutions that people are taking? How can we organize the transfer of such, as we said, urban knowledges, and maybe to also to other places? And what does this then also mean for the urban-rural linkages that we are interested in today's session? I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and look forward to this discussion.